November 18, 1944. The Hürtgen Forest, Germany. The fog clung to the valley like a burial shroud. Through the skeletal remains of spruce and pine, German observers peered eastward from their fortified positions along the Siegfried Line. Major Friedrich Lengfeld adjusted his field glasses, watching the last American squads retreat through the shattered forest below. Their uniforms were mud-caked, their movements sluggish with exhaustion. For 6 weeks, the Wehrmacht had held this cursed woodland against wave after wave of American infantry. Now, finally, the forest had consumed them. The Americans were breaking. Lengfeld lowered his glasses and allowed himself the faintest smile. The defensive line had held. Intelligence reports confirmed what his eyes told him. The U.S. 28th Infantry Division was spent, casualties mounting past 60%. No army could sustain such losses and continue. The forest had always been Germany's ally. Dense, unforgiving, it swallowed tanks and men alike, turned every meter into a killing ground where German machine guns and artillery could exact their terrible mathematics. The Americans had learned what the Wehrmacht had always known. Some ground could not be taken, only died for. Behind the German lines, officers gathered in a captured bunker, studying maps by lantern light. The mood carried cautious optimism. The Battle of the Hürtgen had become a mirror of the Eastern Front's grinding attrition, except here the Germans held the advantage of terrain and preparation. Every road was mined. Every clearing was registered for artillery. Every approach was a corridor of death. The Americans had thrown themselves against these defenses with characteristic industrial determination. But even American industry could not manufacture men fast enough to replace what the forest consumed. Lengfeld and his fellow commanders allowed themselves to believe what the evidence suggested. The offensive was spent. Winter approached. The front would stabilize. They had won time. What they did not know, what they could not have known, was that the fog concealing their valley concealed something else entirely. The German High Command had built its strategy on certain assumptions. They knew American doctrine, methodical, firepower-dependent, resistant to casualties. They had studied the campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, and France. The Americans advanced with overwhelming material superiority, but withdrew when losses mounted. They were pragmatic, their commanders answerable to a democracy that tallied its dead in newspapers. The Wehrmacht officers believed they understood their enemy's breaking point. 6 weeks and 8,000 casualties should have reached it. But they had miscalculated the nature of American resolve, and they had fundamentally misunderstood American logistics. That morning, November 18th, while German observers watched the retreat through the fog, something was happening in the valleys behind the American lines. It began as sound, a low rumble that might have been distant thunder or Allied bombers returning from a raid. But the sound grew, and it did not fade. It rolled across the landscape like an approaching storm, deep and mechanical and unceasing. Then they came through the fog, not broken men retreating, but fresh divisions advancing. The U.S. 4th Infantry Division, rested and full strength, 7,000 men moving forward in combat columns. Behind them came armor, Sherman tanks by the dozens, their engines roaring, treads grinding through mud that would have trapped lighter vehicles. Behind the Shermans came tank destroyers, self-propelled artillery, half-tracks filled with infantry, trucks loaded with ammunition and supplies in quantities that seemed impossible. The road network behind American lines had been transformed into an assembly line of war, and what rolled forward through the fog was not desperation but industrial renewal. German forward observers frantically called in artillery, but even as shells began to fall, more Americans appeared. The 8th Infantry Division moving up from reserve positions. The 5th Armored Division deployed from rear areas. Fresh battalions relieving exhausted ones in a rotation that military science dictated should have been impossible to execute in such terrain. But the Americans were executing it anyway, feeding new strength into the battle while simultaneously evacuating their wounded, resupplying their units, and maintaining combat effectiveness across a front that should have collapsed under its own logistics. Major Lengfeld watched the American advance resume and felt something cold settle in his chest. This was not supposed to happen. The calculations had been clear. You could not sustain such casualties. You could not replace men and material at such rates. The laws of war, proven across centuries, dictated that armies bled white could not simply regenerate. Yet here, emerging from the fog like some inexhaustible force of nature, came proof that American military power operated by different mathematics entirely. The symbolic object was not a weapon or a banner. It was a can. In the pockets of advancing American infantrymen, in the ration boxes stacked in every supply truck, in the field kitchens being set up even as artillery fell around them, were small olive-drab cans. C-rations. Each contained a complete meal: meat, vegetables, biscuits, coffee, sugar, cigarettes. German soldiers, surviving on black bread and thin soup, had found these cans on captured Americans and regarded them with something between contempt and wonder. Who brought cigarettes to war? Who packaged meals like consumer goods and distributed them to millions? But those cans represented something the Wehrmacht had failed to comprehend. They were the physical manifestation of an industrial capacity so vast that it could wage war and maintain peacetime standards of living simultaneously. While German civilians tightened belts and soldiers foraged, American troops ate better in combat than German civilians ate at home. Each can was a small demonstration of abundance, but multiplied across millions of men, across thousands of miles, they became a statement. America could afford this war. It had not mobilized its full capacity. It was not straining. This was sustainable. The advance through the Hürtgen resumed with mechanical inevitability. Where German defenders destroyed one American company, another appeared. Where artillery shattered one tank column, another rolled forward. The Americans learned slowly. Their tactics remained costly, their infantry still too concentrated, their reliance on roads predictable. But they learned continuously because they could afford the tuition of blood. Each division withdrawn was rested, refitted, and returned. Each casualty was replaced. The grinding attrition that should have broken the offensive instead became its methodology. German commanders watched their carefully prepared defenses overwhelmed not by superior tactics, but by superior logistics. The Siegfried Line, designed to halt offensives through firepower and fortification, discovered its enemy could absorb every blow and return stronger. For the first time, Wehrmacht officers confronted a terrifying reality. They were fighting an enemy that could lose battles and still win wars because the industrial base producing American military power was untouched, unlimited, and operating at a scale beyond European comprehension. In captured German documents from this period, a shift in language appears. Early reports describe American attacks as predictable and unimaginative. By late November, words like relentless and inexhaustible dominate. German after-action reports stop predicting American collapse and start calculating German survival. The psychological transformation was complete. The Wehrmacht was no longer fighting to win, but to endure until something, some miracle, some political change, some exhaustion of enemy will, might save them. But America's will showed no sign of exhaustion. Behind the soldiers coming through the fog stood factories producing more tanks than Germany's entire industrial capacity, more aircraft than could be counted, more ammunition than could be expended. Behind the factories stood a civilian population that had not seen bombing, had not known occupation, had not calculated meals and calories or warmth in coal rations. The American home front was not suffering through war. It was booming, producing unprecedented prosperity while simultaneously producing unprecedented military power. This was the revelation that broke German military confidence more thoroughly than any defeat. America was not straining. This vast expenditure of men and material, this endless supply of fresh divisions and new equipment, represented a fraction of American capacity. The United States was fighting a multi-front global war and simultaneously raising living standards at home. It was the abundance that destroyed hope, not the violence. The Battle of the Hürtgen Forest continued through December, consuming American and German lives in terrible mathematics. The Americans would take the forest, though at costs that military historians still debate. But the outcome was never truly in doubt after that November morning. Once German commanders understood they faced not an army but an industrial system, not a national effort but a national surplus, the war's conclusion became arithmetic. Major Lingfeld survived the Hürtgen Forest. He was captured in March 1945 during the crossing of the Rhine. In American captivity, he received 3 meals daily, medical treatment for a wounded leg, cigarettes with his rations. He later wrote that this was when he truly understood Germany had lost. We could not defeat an enemy that fed its prisoners better than we fed our soldiers. The fog that day concealed not just men but destiny. The inevitable triumph of productive capacity over martial valor, of industrial abundance over military tradition. The German commanders thought they had won because they had bloodied their enemy. But they were fighting a nation that could afford to bleed, that counted casualties and continued, that lost battles and manufactured more soldiers, more tanks, more bullets than any defense could exhaust. The Americans rising from the fog were not superior warriors. Many were conscripts, barely trained, frightened of the forest and its killing grounds. But behind them stood the unbreakable fact of American power. A continent untouched by war, factories running 3 shifts, farms feeding 2 hemispheres, and a productive capacity so vast that military expenditure represented not sacrifice but employment. This was the weapon no defense could counter. Not courage, not skill, not superior positioning, but the simple, terrible mathematics of abundance. In the end, the fog lifted. It always does. And what it revealed was the future, not a battle won or lost, but the demonstration of a new kind of warfare where industrial capacity mattered more than tactical brilliance, where logistics determined destiny, and where the nation that could sustain loss indefinitely would inevitably overcome the nation that could not. The forest remembered everything. The German confidence, the American blood, the moment when commanders realized that courage alone could not defeat capacity. What rose from that fog was not just reinforcements, but revelation. The knowledge that some powers cannot be resisted, only endured until they reshaped the world in their image. America had not come to the Hürtgen to win a battle. It had come to demonstrate that it could afford any price, absorb any loss, and continue until nothing stood against it. That was the truth the fog concealed and then revealed, not who fought better, but who could fight longer. And in that calculation, as in all calculations of abundance versus attrition, there was only ever one outcome.